Life was being sold for pennies on the dollar, a future bartered away under a merciless sun. But for one dying man, it was worth more than his last breath. It was a debt he didn't know he owed, a final promise to a ghost, paid with his very last dollar. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust tasted of endings. It settled on every surface, a fine, gritty powder coating the cracked leather of worn-out boots and the sweat-slicked brims of dusty hats. It clung to the air itself, a permanent haze that blurred the edges of the horizon and made the sun a malevolent, white-hot eye in the bleached sky. Here, in the forgotten corner of a town that time was actively trying to erase, commerce had taken on its most primitive form. They were auctioning off debt, which meant they were auctioning off people. On the crude wooden platform stood a girl, no older than 17. Her name, the auctioneer had barked, was Maria. She was with child, a fact announced with the same detached tone one might use to describe a mare's bloodline. She stood unnaturally still, her hands clasped over the slight swell of her belly, a protective gesture that was as futile as it was heartbreaking. Her gaze was fixed on a loose floorboard at her feet, refusing to meet the avaricious eyes of the men below. In the sparse crowd, leaning against a splintered post, was Elias Thorne. The dust had settled on him too, finding a home in the deep lines etched around his eyes and the hollows of his cheeks. A sickness was eating him from the inside out, a slow, patient thief stealing his breath, his strength, his future. Each inhale was a shallow, ragged affair, each exhale a quiet surrender. The men around him, men he'd known his whole life, bid with casual cruelty, their voices a low rumble of appraisal and possession. They saw a strong back, a pair of hands for labor, a vessel. Elias saw something else. He saw a mirror, a warped and painful reflection of a life he had once dreamed of, a future that had withered on the vine just like the crops on his barren ranch. The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly drone, a rhythmic chant of numbers that rose and fell with the indifferent nods and gestures of the bidders. $20, I have 20. Do I hear 25? A strong girl, folks, with years of work in her. 25, thank you, sir. Do I hear 30? Each number was a hammer blow, driving a nail deeper into the coffin of the girl's freedom. Elias felt a tremor in his chest, a dry, rasping cough that he fought to suppress. He closed his eyes, and for a moment the dust and the heat and the cruel voices dissolved. He was somewhere else, another time. The sun was gentle, golden, spilling over the green pastures of his ranch. Sarah was there, his Sarah. Her laughter was the sound of wind chimes, her hair the color of spun gold in the late afternoon light. She was turning toward him, her hands covered in soil from her garden, a smudge of dirt on her nose. "We'll fill this land with life, Elias," she had said, her eyes shining with a fierce, beautiful hope. "Children, horses, so much noise and laughter this old valley won't know what hit it." He had pulled her close, the smell of earth and sunlight enveloping him, and believed her with every fiber of his being. The ranch wasn't just land and timber then. It was a promise. It was the container for a future so bright it had seemed impossible to tarnish. He had been a king in those days, strong and capable, the master of his small, perfect world. A sharp crack brought him back, the auctioneer's gavel hitting the lectern. $35? A steal at 35, gentlemen. Going once? The sound echoed in the hollow space where his memories had been. The green pasture was gone, replaced by the parched, cracked earth of the present. Sarah was a ghost. And the bidding was climbing higher than the few crumpled bills in his pocket could ever reach. The bidding stalled at $40. The man who held the bid was Silas Croft, a rancher whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. His land bordered Elias's, and for years Silas had watched with predatory patience as Elias's fortunes dwindled. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked the girl up and down. $40 for damaged goods, a man near Elias muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. What's he want with her anyway? Another man chuckled, a low, guttural sound. Silas always likes to own things no one else can have. Their words were flies buzzing around a carcass, and Elias felt a cold fury rise within him, a feeling so potent it momentarily eclipsed his physical pain. He pushed himself off the post, his body protesting with a fresh wave of agony. The sickness was a constant companion, a weight that pulled him down, reminding him of his own decay, his own damaged goods. He instinctively clutched the small leather pouch in his coat pocket. It was worn smooth from years of handling, the stitching frayed. Inside was the sum total of his worldly existence, the last remnants of a life spent wresting a living from an unforgiving land. It wasn't much. It was next to nothing. The townspeople barely saw him anymore. He was a specter of the man he used to be, a walking reminder of drought and bad luck. When they did look, their eyes held a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw failure. Let them, he thought. Let them see a ghost. A ghost has no shadow, and he could move through them, unnoticed, his purpose his own. Silas caught his eye for a moment, a flicker of dismissive recognition, before turning his attention back to his prize on the block. The arrogance on Silas's face was a key, unlocking another door in the dusty, cluttered rooms of Elias's memory. The memory that surfaced was cold and sterile. It smelled of antiseptic and fear. He and Sarah were sitting in a doctor's office in a city 2 days' ride away, perched on uncomfortable chairs under a light that was too bright. The doctor, a man with soft hands and a tired, sympathetic face, spoke in low, gentle tones, but his words were brutal. They were a verdict. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thorne. The damage from the fever, it's just not possible." Elias remembered the world narrowing to a single point. Sarah's hands, clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. He had reached for her, but she had flinched, pulling away as if his touch might break her. The vibrant color he so loved in her seemed to drain away in that moment, leaving behind a fragile, grayscale version of the woman he knew. The long ride home was silent. The silence followed them, a third passenger, and it took up residence in their small ranch house. It sat between them at the dinner table. It lay between them in their bed. The ranch, once the symbol of their shared dream, transformed into a sprawling 20,000-acre monument to their failure. The empty fields, the quiet barns, the house that would never echo with the sound of children's laughter, it all became a source of quiet, constant torment. Sarah had faded, her spirit withering like the unplanted crops. She had looked out at the land not with hope, but with a profound, unbreachable sorrow. Elias had tried to fight it, to work himself to exhaustion, to beat back the silence with the sweat of his brow, but it was a battle he could not win. Back in the oppressive heat of the auction, the irony was a physical blow. A pregnant girl, her belly a vessel of the very life that had been denied to him and Sarah, was being sold to a man like Silas, a man who would possess that life, but never cherish it. The thought settled in his bones, not as anger anymore, but as a cold, hard certainty. The auctioneer raised his gavel. His voice, slick with feigned impatience, cut through the thick air. $40, going once, going twice. Silas Croft puffed out his chest. The victor. The other men had lost interest, already turning away, shuffling their feet in the dirt. It was over. But then, a quiet disruption. Elias pushed off the post and began to move. It was not the shuffling gait of a sick old man, but a walk of deliberate, inexorable purpose. He moved through the small crowd, and men who had ignored him for years stepped aside, their expressions shifting from indifference to surprise, then to bewilderment. They parted for him as if he were a force of nature, a sudden shift in the wind. He didn't shove. He didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on the platform, a burning intensity in their depths that silenced the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the assembly. He ignored Silas's indignant stare. He ignored the confused look on the auctioneer's face. He was a ghost no longer. He was a presence, a question mark thrown into the middle of a simple, ugly equation. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. What was the old man doing? What could he possibly do? His poverty was as well known as the endless drought. His frailty was a public spectacle. Yet here he was, challenging the natural order of things, a dying man walking toward a confrontation he could not possibly win by any conventional measure. The rhythmic tapping of the auctioneer's gavel had ceased. The only sound was the scuff of Elias's boots in the thick dust and the ragged whisper of his own breathing. He was an interruption, a pause in the day's cruel business. And in that pause, the tension stretched thin, ready to snap. He reached the foot of the platform and stopped, finally raising his head to meet the auctioneer's gaze. The silence was absolute. Elias did not look at the girl. To look at her would be to acknowledge a connection that he had not yet earned. His business was with the men who presumed to trade in human lives. He met the eyes of the auctioneer, a man named Harris, whom he had known since they were boys. Harris, who had once shared dreams with him under this same unforgiving sky, now stood as the master of this grim ceremony, his face a mask of professional detachment. With a hand that trembled not from fear but from the sickness that racked his frame, Elias reached into his coat. He pulled out the old leather pouch. The crowd, now utterly captivated by this bizarre theater, leaned in. Silas Croft let out a short, derisive laugh. Elias ignored him. He fumbled with the drawstring, his numb fingers struggling with the familiar knot. Finally, it came loose. He upended the pouch into his other palm, a calloused and trembling cup of flesh. The contents were pitiful. A small collection of crumpled, sweat-stained bills and a smattering of dull coins. Not $40. Not even close. He held it out for Harris to see. The offering was so meager, so utterly insufficient, that a wave of fresh mockery rippled through the onlookers. The whispers were sharp, cruel. Has he lost his mind? That wouldn't buy a lame horse. Silas's laughter boomed now, a proud, ugly sound meant to humiliate. "What is that, Thorne?" he bellowed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Are you making a donation to the poor?" The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. From Elias's perspective, the faces in the crowd blurred into a single, sneering mask. He felt the sting of their derision, a hot flush of shame that rose from his chest to his face. But beneath the shame, a deeper resolve cooled into steel. He had known this would happen. This was part of the price. "It is all I have," Elias said. His voice was a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper, yet it carried across the unnatural silence that followed Silas's outburst. He raised his trembling hand higher, the meager collection of bills and coins resting in his palm. He held the auctioneer's gaze, a silent plea, and a challenge all at once. Then, with his other hand, he reached back into the empty leather pouch, his fingers searching for one last item. He withdrew it and held it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a single silver dollar, tarnished with age and the oils of his skin, its edges worn smooth. It was not like the other coins. It held a weight far beyond its denomination. He placed it carefully on top of the crumpled bills. The sun caught the dull metal, and for an instant it shone. That gleam of silver sent him tumbling back into the darkest room of his memory. Sarah, pale and frail against the white pillows of her sickbed, her breathing as ragged as his was now. The life was leaving her. He could see it, a tide going out, never to return. She had pressed that very coin into his hand, her own fingers cold and weak. "For a dream, Elias," she had whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Our dream got lost. Don't you lose it too. Don't let the land be the only thing you have left. Promise me." He had closed his hand around the coin, its coolness a stark contrast to the heat of his tears. He had promised. It was a promise he had failed to keep. He had let the ranch become his whole world, a dusty tomb of regret. Until now. This was not a bid. This was a penance. It was the fulfillment of a sacred vow. The silver dollar wasn't just money. It was Sarah's last breath, his broken promise, and his one final chance at redemption. The change in the auctioneer was subtle, but absolute. The mask of the cynical businessman fell away, and for a moment, he was just Harris, the boy who had known Elias Thorne when his back was straight and his laugh was easy. He saw the story in the old man's eyes. He saw the tarnished silver dollar and understood, in a way the rest of the crowd could not, that he was not witnessing a financial transaction. He was witnessing a confession, a final reckoning. The crowd had fallen completely silent. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a dense, uneasy awe. They didn't understand the particulars, but they understood the gravity. They were watching a man offer up his soul. Only Silas remained untouched by the moment's sanctity. His pride was stung, his authority challenged by a dying man's sentimental gesture. "This is a farce," he roared, his face purpling with rage. "I have the standing bid. $40. Are you running an auction or a charity, Harris?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge. Harris was a man of rules, of ledgers and profits. His livelihood depended on the cold arithmetic of the highest bidder. He looked from Silas's furious face to the pathetic pile of money in Elias's hand, crowned by its single luminous silver dollar. He looked at Elias, whose entire life story seemed to be written in the desperate hope on his face. Then, his gaze drifted to the girl on the platform, Maria. For the first time all day, she had lifted her head. Her eyes were not on the crowd, not on Silas, not even on the auctioneer. They were fixed on Elias Thorne. And in their dark depths, the terror that had lived there was being replaced by a fragile, tentative, impossible flicker of hope. The world held its breath. The sun beat down. The dust settled. Everything depended on the next sound. Harris lifted the heavy wooden gavel. He held it suspended in the air for a heart-stopping second, the fulcrum on which two futures balanced. The silence was so profound that Elias could hear the frantic beating of his own heart, a frantic drum signaling the end of a long, lonely war. Harris's eyes met Silas's one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Pity, perhaps, or a final, weary defiance of the world he inhabited. Then he looked at Elias, a long, slow nod of understanding passing between the two old men. He did not look at the money again. The amount was an insult to the gesture. The gesture was all that mattered. The gavel came down, not with the sharp cracking report of a business deal concluded, but with a soft, decisive thud that seemed to absorb all the tension from the air. "Sold," Harris said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying to every corner of the stunned assembly. To Elias Thorne. He did not state the price. To do so would have been a profanity. The word hung in the air, clean and final. Silas stood frozen for a second, his face a mask of disbelief turning to raw fury. He spat on the ground, a final, impotent gesture of contempt, and stormed away, shouldering men aside as he went. His departure broke the spell. The crowd began to dissolve, the men shuffling off in pairs and small groups, their voices low and murmuring. They were unsettled, as if they had witnessed something private and sacred that they were not meant to see. Elias felt the last of his strength drain out of him. His legs gave way and he slumped against the side of the platform, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. It was done. He had nothing left. Not a dollar, not a dream deferred. He had poured it all out, right here in the dust. And for the first time in years, a profound, bone-deep peace settled over him. He did not know how long he sat there, his head bowed, the world a blur of dust and fading light. A small sound brought him back, the scuff of a worn shoe on wood. He looked up. The girl, Maria, was standing at the edge of the platform looking down at him. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a hesitant, questioning gratitude. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints screaming in protest. He offered a hand to help her down, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her hand was small and cool in his own rough, calloused one. They stood for a moment in the empty square, two strangers bound together by an act of desperate grace, the dying man and the girl carrying new life. Without a word, he turned and began to walk, and she fell into step beside him. They moved through the now empty streets of the town and out onto the long, dusty road that led to his ranch. The silence between them was not the suffocating silence he had known with Sarah after their loss. It was a quiet space of mutual understanding, a shared emptiness waiting to be filled. They walked toward the place that had been his prison of memory, the sprawling, barren land that had mocked him with its emptiness. But as he looked at it now, with the setting sun casting long shadows and this young woman walking silently by his side, it felt different. The ranch was no longer just a monument to what was lost. Her presence, the nascent life she carried within her, was not a painful reminder of his own failure. It was a seed. It was a chance. It was not a happy ending. He was still a sick man, his days numbered and finite. The future was a vast, unknowable territory, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deeper than his illness, that in his final days, he had not surrendered to the dust. He had planted a tree he would never see grow, a final act of defiance that would be his true legacy.